Hi, welcome to the Personal History Hub. This video is all about US tactics used during the Vietnam conflict. So, just a bit of background to start with. The methods used by the USA changed during the course of the 1960s, but were all mainly based upon these key principles. So, one is air power, enabling them to destroy enemy supply lines and equip their own forces by using air power. Superior artillery and equipment. So in most pitched battles, the superior US resources would prove to be decisive. 3, killing larger numbers of the enemy. So the US commander in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, was convinced that a high enemy body count would bring victory. Most of America's tactics in the war were destructive and usually made people in the South anti-USA. They caused lots of what was called collateral damage, so that means unintended damage to villages, crops, and civilians. So I'm going to run through a couple of the different tactics then used by America. I'm going to start with Operation Rolling Thunder. So at the beginning of 1965, there were no US ground troops in Vietnam. Johnson therefore thought that he could force the North Vietnamese to peace talks without having to send troops. On the 7th of February 1965, the USA launched Operation Rolling Thunder. It involved widespread bombing raids on military and industrial targets in North Vietnam. It was the beginning of an air offensive that was to last until 1968. Gradually, the targets were extended to include cities in North and South Vietnam. The original intention was for an 8-week surgical bombing offensive, but it actually lasted for more than 3.5 years and became blanket bombing, just outright bombing everything rather than targeting something specific. The USA dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped by the Allies during the whole of World War II. The cost was huge. In 1967, the US magazine Life calculated that to kill one Viet Cong fighter, it cost the USA $400,000. This figure included 75 bombs and 400 artillery shells. It aimed to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail to stop supplies and war industry. It also caused destruction by the use of napalm, which was a slow-burning petrol mixture that sticks to the skin, and via pineapple bombs. So they're canisters that explode and shoot pellets everywhere like bullets. In some limited ways, the operation could be seen as a success. It did damage the North Vietnam war effort and disrupt supply routes. Towns in North Vietnam were damaged. However, the operation is widely considered to be a failure. North Vietnam had few factories to bomb, and the bombs did not stop the supplies from getting into the south. More significantly, the operation encouraged even greater support from the North Vietnamese. It simply made them more determined. Thousands of civilians were being killed, which was also bad for public opinion in the USA and worldwide. Sending in the troops then. So as the USA increased the amount of Rolling Thunder bombings, it also set up more aircraft bases in Vietnam. These were very obvious targets for the Vietnamese, such as Pleiku that we've been introduced to before. General Westmoreland, who was in charge of US operations in Vietnam, asked for ground troops to protect these bases. This would be another step in the escalation of war. Between the 8th and 10th of March 1965, 3,500 Marines landed at Da Nang. Up until this point, the only US fighting troops in Vietnam, apart from the Green Berets and military advisors, were the Air Force. As Operation Rolling Thunder continued to bomb North Vietnam, more and more ground forces were sent to South Vietnam. Johnson used the draft to get the greater number of troops needed, so that was simply kind of selecting people on a kind of lottery basis to go and join up in Vietnam. The draft was never popular and was actually a significant cause of opposition to the war. So kind of forcing men of a certain age to go and fight in Vietnam actually was one of the things that started to spark the anti-war movement that I'll do a video on much later. So here you can see the number of US troops in Vietnam. So there's a huge significant increase between 1964 and 1965, and then by 1968 there's over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So another method used by the US was search and destroy. So Westmoreland established secure and heavy defended US bases in the south of the country near the coast. From here, US and armed forces launched what were called search and destroy tactics using helicopters. They would descend on a village suspected of assisting Viet Cong fighters and destroy it. The troops called these attacks Zippo raids, after the name of the cigarette lighters they used to set fire to the thatched houses of the villages. These attacks were often based on questionable intel. These raids would kill some Viet Cong guerrilla fighters. However, US troops would often walk into traps. Incorrect information often meant that innocent villagers were killed as well, and just whole villages were completely destroyed when there'd sometimes be no VC soldiers there at all. This in turn made the USA and the ARVN very unpopular with many South Vietnamese peasants, who would then be more likely to support the Viet Cong. Civilian casualties were often very high, with most having little or no connection to the Viet Cong. So Operation Cedar Falls in 1967, an example of how search and destroy tactics failed. Over 30,000 US and ARVN troops took part in this mission in the Iron Triangle, where VC was strongest. Helicopters transported troops to the village of Ben Suc. Villagers were flown to refugee camps and the village was burned. Troops then moved across the Iron Triangle for 3 weeks. At the end, there were 750 VC dead, but 450 US and ARVN dead. There were 3,500 refugees from the Ben Suc area alone. After US troops had cleared an area, it became a free fire zone that could be bombed without warning at any time. In many cases, villagers failed to understand this and returned to their homes. In other areas, villagers were given warnings of bombings, often in the form of leaflets, but they could not read the leaflets. So the leaflets would often be written in English, and most of the villagers wouldn't be able to read English. So, problems with these raids. Raids were often based on poor or sketchy information. Inexperienced troops often walked into traps. Innocent villagers were mistaken for Viet Cong bases. Civilian casualties were very high in these raids. For every VC weapon that was captured by these raids, there was a body count of usually around 6 people. Many of these people were innocent civilians and not actually VC. This tactic caused great suffering for many of the Vietnamese. However, many American troops who took part in these search and destroy missions suffered considerably too. Years afterwards, many suffered panic attacks and nightmares from their memories of the raids. American soldiers also suffered in another way. The Viet Cong soon began to follow a very similar tactic called find and kill an American. Another tactic that the Americans used was the use of chemical weapons or defoliation sprays. So the USA could not force the Viet Cong into battle. The decision was therefore made to use chemical weapons to destroy the jungle that hid the enemy and their food supplies. One such weapon was known as Agent Orange, a highly toxic weed killer used to destroy the jungle, known as a defoliant. The Americans used 82 million litres of Agent Orange to spray thousands of square metres of jungle. So something called Operation Ranch Hand. The defoliation program was called Operation Ranch Hand, and between 1964 and 1970, over 24% of South Vietnam was sprayed with some kind of herbicide. One plane could spray 300 acres in just 4 minutes. The herbicides were 50% stronger than those used in the USA. Agent Blue was used to kill crops, and Agent Orange to destroy the jungle. Over 3,000 villages were sprayed, many without getting the villagers out first. By 1970, there was clear proof that the herbicides used in Vietnam were a huge danger to health. Rain carried the chemicals into streams and rivers, and it affected those who drank the water. The poison stayed in the soil too and affected harvests for decades after the war had ended. So that's how they would go about doing it through planes. So the American use of napalm. So napalm was a chemical weapon. Napalm, used from 1965, was another chemical widely used by the USA. It was the type of bomb that exploded and showered the surrounding victims with a burning petroleum jelly. It contained petrol, chemical, and phosphorus. Napalm sticks to the skin and burns at 800 degrees. It burnt through the skin down to the bone, so it's pretty terrifying. Upon seeing helicopters hovering above, villagers in North Vietnam would flee the scene of a napalm attack, fearing for their lives. So a little bit more about Agent Orange then. So this is one of the rainbow herbicides, so similar to Agent Blue that we mentioned before as well, developed in the USA in the 1960s. These chemicals were so named because they were named after colours. So what did it do? Agent Orange destroyed hectares of forests and crops, stripping the trees of their leaves and polluting air, soil, rivers, and water supplies. The chemical was also dangerous to humans, and contamination caused cancer and birth defects in Vietnamese. So up to 500,000 children are estimated to have been born with birth defects due to Agent Orange. And it also did affect US forces as well. So the policy of hearts and minds. So America invested heavily in South Vietnam to improve the living conditions for the people there. This was done in a number of ways. Peasants in the countryside were helped to improve their farming methods, so for example by digging drainage ditches. Communications were improved by the building of roads, canals and bridges. In the towns, schools and clinics were built. Refugees from North Vietnam were given homes. All of this was done to show that the USA was on South Vietnam's side and to try and gain the support of the South Vietnamese by winning their hearts and minds. This tactic had some success, and the towns and cities of South Vietnam tended to stay loyal to the government and to the Americans. However, it was less effective in the rural areas that were dominated by the Viet Cong. The conclusions then on US tactics in Vietnam. These tactics were overall not successful in defeating the Viet Cong. This is because they had destroyed the countryside, killed and wounded thousands of civilians, so it was unlikely that villages and civilians were going to be supporting somebody who had destroyed their countryside and their villages. World opinion also turned against the USA. So this was one of the first wars to be kind of fully televised into people's living rooms, and people saw how awful some of these things that the US were doing was. The tactics alienated the South Vietnamese and pushed them towards communism, basically having the complete opposite effect that America wanted. Okay, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snow History Hub. The next video is going to be on the Tet Offensive of 1968.